Good morning, and welcome to the Los Angeles World Affairs Council and Town Hall. I'm Rachel Kinderdine, Community Manager, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to today's program, Alive in Intelligence from Soviet Afghanistan to Osama bin Laden. Today, we are joined by Michael Vickers, former U.S. Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence and author of the new memoir, by all means available, Memoirs of Alive in Intelligence, Special Operations, and Strategy. We are also joined by our moderator, Greg Miller, investigative foreign correspondent with the Washington Post, who is with us today from London. For those of you who would like to submit questions to our speakers, there is a Q&A button at the bottom of the screen where you can type in your questions. I'll be managing those questions during the Q&A segment, which should start in about 35 minutes. So thank you both so much for being here, and Greg, I will hand the conversation over to you.
Thanks very much, Rachel, and thank you to the Los Angeles World Affairs Council. It's great to be with all of you. Mike and I are both native Californians. Mike happens to be in Southern California at the moment, and I'm in London, as Rachel said, but heading back to California over the holidays and can't wait to get there. Let me just start by trying to capture what I find so remarkable about Mike and about his book. Mike Vickers has had one of the most remarkable careers anyone has ever had in the realm of national or global security. I don't know of anyone who has been more involved in more consequential issues and operations over the past 30 years, nor do I know anyone whose involvement spans such a range of responsibility, from carrying out clandestine operations on the ground as a special forces and CIA officer, to making decisions and influencing policy at the very highest levels in Washington. Now, obviously, he's written a book, by all means available, and it too is remarkable. We often see books billed as an insider account of this or that, but Mike's book is the rare volume that delivers on that claim. You follow him from elite training facilities to global hotspots on multiple continents to the Situation Room for moments of such historic magnitude as the bin Laden raid. Our conversation today will focus and touch on, I think, topics that cover this range and give you a feel, I hope, for Mike's tremendous experience and expertise. But if you don't mind, Mike, I'd like to start by talking about one of the first moments in the early pages of the book that caught my attention and sort of it made me think again of the point you raise in your book about the extent to which people have at times underestimated you or failed to grasp the sorts of experiences and your capabilities. There's a scene early in the book where Mike is in training exercises as a Green Beret. Correct me if I'm wrong, Mike. And he describes jumping out of an airplane, and it's something called halo, which refers to high altitude, low opening, which basically means you jump out of a plane at 30,000 feet, but you don't open your parachute until you get down to about 2,500 feet. So you're free falling through the sky for tens of thousands of feet. That sounds daunting enough, but in your training, you talk about how you had to do it to simulate combat conditions by jumping with a rucksack that had been packed with sand. In your case, not well packed with sand. The instructor had packed it such that it was lopsided or bulging on one side. And this became one of the most harrowing experiences that I can imagine. And I'm going to read you just a bit of language from Mike's book. As soon as I exited the plane, he writes, I went into a violent spin. He tumbled facing skyward for thousands of feet like an upside-down turtle. Only after arching back violently did he right himself, and then had to contort himself further to stop the spin before, thankfully, executing the landing with seconds to spare. And you write at the end of this, after I landed safely, I took the rucksack home that night and packed it myself. I wanted to, as I read this, Mike, I wanted to know, is that really how the story ended? I mean, what really happened when you did land and survive that terrifying experience?
Well, that is exactly how it happened. I was very happy that I landed safely. It took several thousand feet to get stable. And I knew it was going to be trouble when I looked at it because the sand was bulging out of one side. And in free fall, you control your position by balancing your arms and your legs and arching your back. And you turn by adjusting that. And this thing just caused violent spins. And so having survived that, I was a second lieutenant at the time. It was my second jump. The first one went very well, just jumping straight without any equipment. And so the instructor said, "Here, jump with this," and gave me the rucksack and a weapon. And I thought I better repack it and make sure it would be stable for future jumps, which it was.
How did you close things out with that instructor, however, after that jump?
I was happy to have survived, and so I didn't say anything. I mean, maybe I should have or reported it, but I don't know if he knew what he was doing or just thought it wouldn't be quite as dangerous as it turned out to be. But yeah, I just happy to have survived it, repacked it, and went on with the rest of the course.
Well, we're happy that you survived as well. And I think the country is happy that you survived. I mentioned that passage just to try to convey to the audience today, some of the very visceral moments that you write about in the book. Of course, you also write about, broader, grander, more sweeping themes. And if it's okay, maybe we could pivot for a moment to the conflict that is raging even as we speak in the world. I'm eager to hear your thoughts about the war in Ukraine, your views on how the counteroffensive that Ukraine launched several months ago is going, and what you think that the struggles that Ukraine is experiencing in breaking through and breaching Russia's defensive lines means for going forward for this war.
Sure. So, it's the biggest conflict in Europe since World War II, and it's of critical strategic importance, not just to Ukraine for its survival, but to Europe and to the United States. Russia, of course, is allied with China, and Ukrainian victory would set them back dramatically. Generally, I think we and our Western partners have supplied the Ukrainians with a lot of equipment, certainly to defend themselves, now reaching some $50 billion, but not enough to win. And we've done it incrementally. So one way to look at this is, we said we weren't going to give them rocket artillery, then we did, or air defense systems to defend their cities, then we did, then tanks, which are finally getting there, and then fighter aircraft, which will get there next year. And the American military wouldn't fight against this kind of enemy, this Russian enemy that, as you said, is dug in so much, without establishing air superiority. And we're hoping that the Ukrainians could do it without that. But in a way, it's really an unrealistic hope. And so the Ukrainian counteroffensive looks like World War I in a lot of ways, where small gains against trench lines and a lot of attrition. And the war will definitely carry into next year. And I hope what we're providing them going forward will enable them to do better next year.
Thoughts? I mean, some of the criticism or concerns that have been expressed by U.S. officials, maybe venturing into the realm of second guessing to, as far as the Ukrainians are concerned, is that the Ukrainians haven't done with this equipment what the West was coaching and training them to do, concentrating force in a specific vector, using combined arms maneuver to maximize effect. As you watch this unfold, is it unrealistic to have those expectations of this army? Is there a disconnect between what the West, how the West is going about trying to help Ukraine, and what Ukraine, because of its history and its situation at the start of the war, is capable of?
Yes, I think there's a bit of merit to the criticism in a sense that if you have limited resources, you should concentrate your force on a decisive point, and the Ukrainians have spread it out a bit. But without air power and without artillery superiority, they would still get bogged down. And so, yes, they're not as proficient as we are at combined arms warfare, but combined arms warfare isn't just tanks and infantry and artillery, it's airplanes too. I mean, that's the way militaries have fought, certainly since World War II and even beginning a bit in World War I. And so I think the expectations were unrealistic, and in a way, it's kind of passing the buck for some of the mistakes that we've made to project them onto the Ukrainians.
So we'll just continue on this topic for just linger a minute or two longer, if that's okay. But let's connect it to your history, your personal history, and your background in a more direct way. I mean, arguably what you are best known for, and one of the most consequential accomplishments of your career, was serving as the architect of the clandestine support to Afghanistan that led to the ouster of Soviet forces at the end of the 1980s, arguably contributing to ultimately the demise of the Soviet Union at the end of the Cold War. You write at length about this experience in your book, and you describe the strategic and tactical changes that you tried to make once you stepped into this space and into this program to try to affect that outcome. And there are some parallels to what's happening in Ukraine, but I wonder, what you think can be applied from your experience in Afghanistan to the Ukraine case. And if I can just sort of underline one final thing, it's, as you note in your book, the Soviets lost 26,000 soldiers over that decade and ultimately acquiesced and left Afghanistan. Russia in Ukraine, it reportedly has already lost more than 120,000 soldiers have been killed and many, many thousands of others wounded. What's it going to take to get them to make a comparable calculation that it's time to get out?
Yeah, so as you rightly point out, there are similarities and differences. That was an insurgency. The Soviet army was spread out across Afghanistan, a country the size of Texas. And so the operations look very differently. This is a higher intensity conventional war. We support it indirectly, but Ukrainians and Russians, it's a direct conflict. And so the casualties are much higher, the systems are different, et cetera. But there are principles that apply. And one of the ways we won, or one of the primary reasons we won in the 1980s, was we achieved escalation dominance. Both we and the Soviets escalated at the same time. When I took over the job as a CIA officer, our budget had already been increased by Congress by 300% or fourfold. And then we went back to the Congress just 6 months later and said, if you double it again, we think we might actually achieve our aim, which in 1985 shifted from just imposing costs on the Soviets to driving them out or trying to win the conflict. And nobody thought that was possible at the time. We've been a little less clear on our objectives in Ukraine. We've said things like we're in it for as long as it takes, but not are we actually trying to liberate Ukrainian territory and defeat the Russian military, or just create conditions for a negotiated settlement. But the scale and speed really applies when you contrast the strategy that, as I said, our policy on Ukraine has been substantive, but more incremental than it was. And, in 1 year, in 1985, our budget went up by a factor of 10. The amount of weapons and everything went into Afghanistan. It was really a shock to the Soviet system at the time. And you know, this one will have a different requirement for an ending, you know, a defeat of the military in eastern Ukraine and maybe a threat to Crimea, but the principles are similar.
So it sounds like you're saying in your case, you know, that it proved critical that there was political support for the operations that you envisioned. Do you believe that there is comparable political support and cohesion in the current context in Ukraine versus Russia?
No, that is one of the big differences, is there was support at the beginning. You know, the Ukrainians have really fought heroically against expectations and had more success than people thought was possible. But you're seeing a diminution of that support in the United States, particularly among growing factions of Republicans, and in the West more broadly. And you know, so that's a real challenge for us going forward. We had broad bipartisan support for our covert action program in Afghanistan in the 1980s. You know, this is often the case in US history. That was considered the good war, the good secret war. Central America was more controversial. And so there was really strong political support, and that matters. And then same thing with allies around the world. You know, the Chinese were our partners in the 1980s, Pakistan, of course, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, United Kingdom, and many others. And so that was a critical factor.
I had a feeling that it wasn't going to take too long in our conversation before the two words escalation dominance appeared in our conversation. It's a theme that you hit on in your book, and a basically sort of a formula that you conclude through your experience is a prerequisite to success in conflicts of all kinds. Can you go a little deeper and talk a little bit more about what you mean by that term, and then again perhaps connect it to the current context and talk about what would be required to achieve it now?
Sure. So the concept originally comes from nuclear strategy. You know, if you think of the intensity of force as a ladder, with the highest being all-out nuclear war and the lowest being very, very limited conflict, you know, high-end conventional war is fairly up that ladder, and very intense insurgency in irregular warfare is up that ladder too. And so what you're trying to do is achieve dominance or tactical and operational overmatch in that realm, to where it doesn't make any sense to escalate further, but you can defeat your adversary. So one example of this is in World War II, the United States had strategic dominance by our industrial capacity. You know, we could just outproduce our adversaries. We got better tactically as the war went on, but you know, it was really that massive industrial capacity to support allies like the Soviet Union, as well as American forces and British and other allied forces around the world. And so it plays out in different ways depending on the conflict. You know, even in a case like our Al-Qaeda drone campaigns, we finally reached a level where we really could paralyze Al-Qaeda and stop them from planning in the Afghanistan-Pakistan border region and then elsewhere by the intensity and operational tempo we achieved. In the special operations forces, you know, for the bin Laden raid, you know, we sent a force of 24 operators to take out what we thought were 4 armed men, you know, to make sure that we had tactical dominance of that local situation. And other forces, a quick reaction force that was twice the size, that was 5 minutes away, aircraft in case there was an air threat that wasn't far away. And so we're trying to achieve that kind of where the adversary realizes he's beaten or can't really contest us.
Let's
to your question about Ukraine. So the fear here is whether the Russians would escalate to tactical nuclear weapons if their conventional force was on the verge of defeat. But it also applies at the conventional level right now, where it's kind of a stalemate. The Ukrainians don't have sufficient force to really defeat the dug-in Russian army right now, although they can hurt it a lot. And the same is true of the Russians. And so that's why you have this war of attrition and a stalemate.
Yeah. You mentioned the Predator campaign, the extent and the way that transformed the struggle against Al Qaeda at the time, and to me, this was, as a reporter, a national security reporter who spent many years covering these issues, covering the post 9/11 period in the United States and around the world. To me, this was one of the most what made reading your book so compelling to me was to revisit these events that we all read about, and that in my case was at times writing about, or at least trying to, but to see it from your point of view and to see it both sort of more strategically, and also to learn new things about these operations and about these strategies that many of us didn't know at the time, hard as we were trying to. Can we spend a few minutes talking about the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan? And I guess sort of the lessons that you arrive at, and so if you would summarize for our audience the lessons you take away from those long conflicts in our recent history.
Sure. So starting with Afghanistan, we were hit from there on 9/11. We had to respond. We were very successful in toppling the Taliban and Al Qaeda within a couple months with an unconventional campaign, special forces and CIA supporting opposition elements backed by US air power. But Al Qaeda spread then. They went to Pakistan, first to the cities. We captured a bunch of them, and then to the border areas where they had a lot of allies. And so our strategy had to adapt to that, and it did over time. And we were quite successful against Al Qaeda there and in Yemen and other places. In Afghanistan, we had mission creep, I think, in the sense that we were lost sight of our principal objective, which was to make sure we never got hit from there again, and couldn't defeat the Taliban because they had sanctuary in Pakistan, and Afghanistan is ideal guerrilla territory. But at the end of the day, we turned a stalemate into a defeat. We weren't defeated by the Taliban. We chose to leave and let them take over. They never could have won with the irony of Afghanistan is that with 150,000 troops in a couple years, we couldn't defeat the Taliban, but with a few thousand and advisors and assistants and air power, the Taliban couldn't win either. And so we kind of had a mixed strategy there, and war's inherently political. And if it lasts 20 years, people are going to get weary of it at some point. You have to take that into account. Going into Iraq, I think, was a strategic mistake. We took our eyes off the prize. We had a series of successful military campaigns from Desert Storm to Afghanistan that I think gave us maybe a bit too much confidence. And then we got, into a civil war and insurgency and an Al Qaeda group in Iraq. Through some great operational success, improved intelligence and other things, we turned the war around, in 2007 to 2010. But then after we withdrew, the remnants of Al Qaeda in Iraq, the Islamic State, recovered in Syria and came back and conquered half the country. And so we had to, in a way, fight that war all over again. And so, those are irregular wars. Largely, the conventional parts of them were pretty straightforward. We had a lot of overmatch. And there's lessons about, I think, one, choosing, not trying to do everything, being careful about your objectives, but also having a sustainable strategy, because those wars tend to go on for a long time.
So I want to dig into this subject a bit more. Can you help me understand, given your experience both as a senior policymaker holding high-level positions at the Pentagon during these conflicts, but also your background as a Green Beret, what makes it so hard for the United States to train and build indigenous forces that are capable of carrying on after the United States either dramatically reduces its footprint or withdraws?
Yeah, here's another irony, is that we can spend billions of dollars training forces, and then they may collapse on us if we're no longer there. We saw that in Iraq in 2014 against ISIS, and then had to rebuild them. We saw that in Yemen when the Houthis took over, and we hadn't spent quite as much in Yemen on the Yemeni government forces, but similar collapse. And then in Afghanistan. And, again, there's a paradox here that with American advisors and support, you can take rudimentary forces and help them win. But investing a lot in them and expecting them necessarily to be able to defeat an external threat or an internal threat may be more challenging. And again, that's part of the lessons of the past few decades is, a little goes a long way, and you really have to think about what's the right force to create. So, in Afghanistan, we had some of our most success with rural villagers that, everybody has a rifle, but they weren't highly trained, but we had special forces advisors with them and denied a lot of territory to the Taliban, rather than trying to build a centralized army that is very dependent on logistics and this and that, and they may not be able to pull that off.
So, and as you come out of this section in the book, you summarize, you boil things down to a few lessons that I thought were pretty interesting. Pithy. One of them is invading a country is a lot easier than pacifying it afterward. Another one is that short wars are better than long wars. Be in it to win it sooner rather than later. And yet elsewhere in the book, Mike, you're sharply critical of President Biden, for example, for withdrawal from Afghanistan, 20 plus years into that conflict. So how do you reconcile those two positions? If it's better to have a short, focused war with clear objectives, wasn't Biden, who seemed to be making the case for that for many, many years regarding Afghanistan, why wasn't he right?
Yeah, so I'm equally critical of President Trump, who, negotiated a disastrous deal that set the stage for that. But an insurgency, as I said, defeating an insurgency just takes time. And so you have to make sure you can sustain the political support. And that's why transitioning in a small footprint approach and being realistic about your objectives seems to be the best strategy. When, great powers get into trouble, when they this sounds simplistic in a sense, or Goldilocks. When they overreach, they try to do too much, or they underreach, they don't do something, and threats gather. And in Afghanistan and Iraq, we had a case of overreach in both cases, where we tried to do too much, things that we necessarily couldn't do. But that doesn't mean we should have lost the war. We had a reasonable success in Colombia but it took 40 some years, and it ebbed and flowed, but we did it with a handful of advisors and some assistance, and never committed combat troops or anything else. And I think we should have followed a similar model at some point after we toppled the Taliban in Afghanistan, and been more realistic about our objectives and getting US force levels down to an advisory level. As I said, the paradox was you couldn't win with 150,000, although you could push the Taliban back, but you also couldn't lose with just a few thousand. And a stalemate is better than a defeat, particularly a self-inflicted one.
Right. So we've talked a bit about the current global affairs and the conflict in Ukraine. We spent a few minutes talking about the recent history of U.S. conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan. Maybe let's fast forward a little bit, because I think one of the most fascinating parts of your book is your assessment of where we are now, where the United States is, where we are globally, and what we are confronting going forward. You call it a new Cold War in your book, and you attribute it to three main causes. One, a failure to fully integrate China and Russia into the US-led international order. Two, significant changes in the balance of power. And three, China and Russia's perception that America is in terminal decline. So what are your prescriptions for policymakers facing this reality, this grim reality?
Yeah, so in the first case, it was probably not achievable for the other two factors to fully integrate China and Russia. We certainly tried with China. We've invested a lot there and over several decades and helped them grow. Obviously less so in Russia. But rising powers tend to want more political influence in the world. That's one of the lessons of history. And shifting from an ally, as China was of ours in the Cold War, to then a competitor is just part of the course of history. That doesn't mean you'll have conflict. Cold War is kind of a scary term, but it really means strategic competition. And the centerpiece of our competition with China is really over influence, but also economic and technological competition. Who's going to have the leading economy in the world, and who's going to have the most advanced technology, and power will flow from that. And the Chinese are stumbling a fair amount now, but I wouldn't count them out in that regard. And so our military goal should be to deter conflict, as we did during the Cold War, the Soviet-American Cold War. But then you still have to try to win or prevail in the peacetime competition, which is a clash of systems across the board, political, social, et cetera. So when I talk to my former colleagues, retired 4-stars and top civilian officials, and this is why I talked about this toward the end of the book, we're most concerned about the domestic bases of our power. Do we have a strong enough national identity? Do we want to remain the leading power in the world? Do we want democracy to prevail? That's going to take some effort, as it did during the Cold War. And if we can handle that, we can do the rest of the equations, as we did early in the Cold War, and then toward the end to do very well.
I want to make sure I understand what you're saying, Mike. Are you saying that in your current conversations, contemporaneous conversations with 4-stars and other very senior officials in national security circles in Washington, you're spending a fair amount of time talking about their concerns about the state of American democracy? Is that right?
Well, broader than democracy, society, sort of the overall health of our economy, which is vibrant, but it's leaving a lot of people behind, and that then has social effects, et cetera. But, that's not our area of expertise. That's ultimately all of society problem, business leaders and political leaders and others. But we look out over the next several decades and think, how will we posture ourselves to prevail? We're more concerned about that factor than we are about China and Russia's threats. Not that they're not more serious threats than we've had in the last 30 years, but strength begins at home. And and that's probably the key message I was trying to convey.
That's pretty remarkable. Would you have said that at any other point in your lifetime or in your career, that concerns about the domestic state of affairs were that pronounced?
Maybe a bit in the 1970s, but not to this extent.
Wow.
We had a lot of trouble in the 1970s, Watergate scandals, loss in Vietnam, but we recovered from that pretty rapidly. And these challenges seem a bit deeper and more systemic.
Well, you go further and you write in your book about going forward, confronting this democracy versus autocracy competition that will pit authoritarian capitalism against democratic capitalism. There will be a competition between fake and real, something I, in my line of work, worry about a great deal, between what is true and what is not true. And then you say it's by no means clear that the United States and its democratic allies are currently postured to prevail. What makes you so concerned, Mike?
Well, authoritarian systems are fragile in their own way. So I don't want to make it sound like it's just democracies that have this problem. But, we're in an information intensive age. And unfortunately, a lot of that information is bogus, but it's like environmental pollution, if you will. And so it's hard to have an informed citizenry when the information environment is so distorted. So there's a challenge, I think, we need to work on. And then the other part of it is by no means clear that authoritarian capitalism will prove to be more productive than democratic capitalism. But the jury's out on that. And unlike the competition in the Cold War with the Soviet Union, where it was a very different and very poor economic system, this one has a lot of the virtues of the West, in a sense that you have a lot of the elements of capitalism. And democracies, if you look around the world right now, in some cases, you still have strong societies economically and maybe militarily, but the politics seems to be a weak link in a lot of democracies. Take the case of Israel. Very strong country, vibrant economy, military, security services, quite secure in a lot of respects. Its politics are a mess. And so you kind of wrestle with this issue of what's going on, what's out there that is causing trouble for our political systems. And, as I tried to say, I think, a big chunk of it is the information environment that has become so problematic. And then just people's different expectations based on other factors in their lives.
We could talk about this for hours. I mean,
Yeah.
as a correspondent for the Post now based in Europe for the past 2 years, it's something I get asked about almost constantly everywhere I go. The basic question, what is happening in America? Is it going to turn back, or is it going to continue down this path? And it's really hard to answer right now. Look, we're going to get to questions from the audience in just a minute. But let me just ask one final thing. You write in the book about other sort of big picture ideas, including space as a new and important domain for competition and potentially conflict. And at one point in the book, you say that space superiority will be to the 21st century conflict what air superiority was to the 20th century conflict. For somebody like me, who's just my feet are on the ground, it's hard to really imagine what any of this looks like. What are you talking about here?
Well, so one, if you think of what air power did, it extended the battlefield both vertically and horizontally in depth to where, you could strike deeper in the enemy's rear and therefore then succeed in ground operations. And space does that even more. Space and cyber are the two inherently global domains, in a sense that you can, if you were to win a conflict in space, as you can win a conflict in the air, then you can project power far more easily globally, and not only win regionally, but project power globally, and then deny your adversary the ability to do the same. And that's true of cyber too. And because of the importance of space, it's become contested countries, the most sophisticated countries around the world, are developing capabilities to interfere with space systems. And space is extending vertically into what we call cislunar space, which is the space between the moon, 90% of the distance to the moon, but between the moon and what we call geostationary orbits, about 23,000 miles from the surface of the Earth. And so it's becoming broader and more important strategically, and that's the point I was trying to convey. And accordingly, it ought to receive commensurate priority in our defense strategy and budgets.
Okay, thanks, Mike. Let's get some questions in from the audience. I'll let Rachel step back in to tee these up for us.
Yes, thank you both so much. We have many great questions to get to. So I want to jump in first. We had several come in about Ukraine and Russia. So this is two questions from our audience. The first, has the House Republican push to limit spending on Ukraine had any impact on either Russia or Ukraine's resolve? And in the same vein, another audience member asked, what do you think the most effective way for the US to support Ukraine will be going forward?
So I think it does have morale effects, positive ones for Vladimir Putin, negative ones for Ukraine and Ukraine's allies. To the first part of your question, you know, Putin has been pretty clear. His strategy is to wait us out, wait the West out. You know, he knows they're not doing so well now. He expected an easy victory, but as he had in previous elections, he's rooting for Donald Trump and is going to do everything he can because he thinks that will weaken Western support for Ukraine and make his job easier. The second part of your question, remind me.
What do you think the best or most effective way for the US to support Ukraine is going forward?
Oh, sure. So I think the Biden administration made the right decision to support Ukraine indirectly, not with American troops, but with materiel assistance and training and, you know, some intelligence support, et cetera. I think that was absolutely the right decision to reduce the risk of escalation. And then the question is, are you doing enough? And I think we're doing 80-90% enough. We've done it a little too slowly, but we just need to do more of what we're doing. Back to the thing that Greg said about shorter wars are better than longer wars whenever possible. That's because longer wars entail more suffering. You know, the economy can't recover, casualties are higher, et cetera. And so we ought to try to bring this conflict to a close as soon as possible. That's probably not possible until sometime in the next year, but that ought to be our goal.
So we actually had a question come in about the US's approach as well. This audience member said, it appears that the US is slow rolling weapons and preventing the Ukrainians from attacking Russia internally, even though Russia is attacking the Ukrainians internally and their people. How can this type of unbalanced warfare allow the Ukrainians to get to a point where Russia will retreat or create a truce? And they went on to say that they understand the US is concerned about escalation, but it appears the Ukrainians can't succeed with this type of unbalanced warfare. If you have any thoughts.
Sure. So one, you know, the war in Ukraine is very important, and as I said, I don't think we're doing enough there. So that's the area I think where we can help the Ukrainians the most to defend their cities, because the Russians have an advantage in attacking civilian areas, and then to defeat the conventional forces, in the battlefield in eastern Ukraine. So the airplanes that will come next year, some of the longer range missiles, all that will help. For escalation management reasons, the U.S. Doesn't want to be party, I guess I would say, to Ukraine striking into Russia, but that hasn't deterred the Ukrainians. And so they've had a lot of success in the Black Sea, attacking Russian warships at ports and air defense systems. They've even, with cheap drones, had strikes in Moscow and others. It's not going to be decisive, but the Ukrainians are hitting back.
So switching gears a bit, this audience member asked, do you see China as the true winner in the Russia versus Ukraine conflict? And do you see any way to divert China's path outlined in the 2027 ultimatum?
So no, I don't think China is the winner because I think for two reasons. One, Russia is an important ally of theirs, a junior partner. And as Russia's become weakened, it's a weaker partner. And so I think that hurts China. And then second, it has to give Xi Jinping some pause to see how poorly the Russian military has performed. His military hasn't fought since 1979 against Vietnam and didn't do so well then. And so that may act as a bit of a deterrent. And then to the 2027 question, for other members of the audience, Xi Jinping told his military to be ready to invade Taiwan by 2027. But the Chinese strategy has always been they think time is on their side. And so I wouldn't put too much stock in, I think Xi Jinping wants to resolve the Taiwan question during his tenure in office, which may be extended, health allowing. So I wouldn't put too much stock in the 2027 number. We'll still be competing with China after that. They have goals out to 2049, the 100th anniversary of the Communist Party coming to power. So there's nothing necessarily magical about that, but we do need to try to deter conflict, to strengthen our defenses. Our position has eroded a bit in the Western Pacific over the past 20 years. Greg cited that earlier about changes in the balance of power, and there's things we need to do in defense planning to try to deter conflict.
Our next audience member also was curious about your opinions about the growing escalation in the South China Sea. They asked, what are your thoughts regarding the ability of the Chinese defense industrial base to churn out naval assets at a much higher rate than the US defense industrial base?
Yeah, that's part of the escalation dominance. So we have quality advantages, but China now has a bigger Navy. And if there were a conflict between China and the United States and allies or whatever, there's no guarantee it'll be a short war. And so the outcome of it, and it may depend on who can produce more weapons over time, win in subsequent rounds, if not the initial rounds. A lot of military history shows that you lose the initial battles and you come back to win the war if you have the capacity. And one of the lessons of the Ukraine conflict is that our defense industrial base is not as robust and, to use an awkward word, mobilizable as it was in World War II. And we're struggling to provide enough weapons for Ukraine to use. So imagine, again, if we were in a direct conflict with another industrial power, that would be a serious strategic issue to make sure we have the capacity to prevail.
So turning to a question about your early career, this audience member said the CIA's introduction of Stinger anti-aircraft weapons in Afghanistan in the mid-1980s is often held up as the main turning point of the conflict. Do you agree, and why?
I don't. I think it had a significant impact, but the Stinger wasn't introduced until September 1986. And by that point, General Secretary Gorbachev had essentially made the decision to withdraw from Afghanistan. The Stinger had a remarkable success rate, about 75 to 80% successful hits on Russian aircraft, and it forced them to fly higher and stop doing certain operations. And so it contributed to convincing the Russians that they should leave. But it wasn't a strategic turning point. The really decisive year of the war was 1985, when both we and the Soviets escalated. And by early 86, General Secretary Gorbachev had decided they couldn't win. And it was one last gasp for victory. And after they were defeated there, then it was a matter of withdrawing their forces over time. So the Stinger contributed to that, but it wasn't the decisive factor. And I would add, in general, with the exception of the atomic bomb, the idea that single weapons are decisive in war rather than lots of factors generally isn't true.
Thank you. So I wanted to start with a compliment from our next audience member who said, I read and greatly enjoyed your well-written book and was particularly impressed with the ease in which you explained complex technical concepts and made intelligence understandable. They went on to say, knowing the intelligence threat faced by those analyzing the challenge posed by the events of January 6, 2021, what would you have done to manage and coordinate the disparate agencies to protect the Capitol?
Um, so first, as we've seen the rise of domestic extremism, there's an intelligence dimension to that, and domestic intelligence is an important component. Now, again, respecting Americans' privacy and civil liberties, and there's much higher burdens for intelligence collection in the United States. FBI has to do it. Our foreign agencies, CIA and others, cannot, rightly so. But after 9/11, the FBI really transformed itself to focus on the terrorism threat from within the United States, the foreign terrorism threat, and did a very good job. It broke up a lot of plots, some near misses, and I think we were late to the game in both the non-foreign, the true domestic extremist threat that was growing in the United States, as well as the threat from the information environment. The Russians had been manipulating social media and others a couple of years before we really got onto it. And so there's some important lessons between 2014 and 2016 about how we should adapt going forward. It's not a question of capability to deal with these groups. The FBI largely dismantled a lot of organized crime when it decided to focus on it, so-called mafia. And it hasn't eliminated crime, obviously, but in the most powerful organizations, it did a pretty good job. And it can do the same thing here. And I think in terms of coordination, the problem was just the dysfunctional government we had at the time. It wasn't that there weren't resources available. It was people weren't making decisions or didn't want to make decisions.
So just a couple of final questions. Is there any part of intelligence training that you think deserves more attention?
Well, intelligence evolves a lot. So a challenge that we face today that's fairly new, it's a result of modern technology, is what we call ubiquitous technical surveillance. So during the Cold War, trying to handle spies in Moscow, the Soviets would put, hundreds of people, direct surveillance, bumper locks on your car or closely following you on foot, and then have people stationed ahead. Today, you can do a lot of that technically. And so China is actually the leader in these smart cities and having cameras everywhere in Beijing, and then artificial intelligence to see what's out of pattern and what isn't. And so it's not that those systems can't be defeated, but it takes new tradecraft to do that, to operate in that, who's watching me, or am I being followed? It's not just the people behind me, and can I detect them when they change clothes or do other things? But what can these cameras see and not? Or how is my pattern out of normal for what I normally do when I'm not doing an intelligence work? And so it's constantly evolving. And that's just part of the intelligence picture. Then there's technical stuff and both collection of communications as well as imagery that, also evolves.
And then for our final question, as we're getting close to the end of the hour, what are some of the moments in your career that left you most proud to be an American?
Oh, well, I'll tell you, maybe just amusing, but when I came out of the White House at 2 a.m. the night of the bin Laden raid to go back to CIA to pick up my car, there were a lot of college students out in the street after President Obama announced that we had killed Osama bin Laden. And they were chanting USA, 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 and then CIA, CIA, CIA. And I thought, I am never going to hear this again in my life. So I just thought to pause here at the White House and listen to it for a few moments. So it made me proud to be an American there. But um, some of the heroic actions. I wish I could tell more about young Americans who have just done phenomenal things, dangerous things, phenomenal things to help keep our country safe. And I would add, as a father of 5 daughters, women are critically important in intelligence and in our military, increasingly important in our military. And if Al Qaeda knew how much American women have been responsible for their demise, I think, given their views about women, it would make them pretty unhappy. But I'm enormously proud of them.
Thank you, Mike. And I think we do have time for one more question that just came in, if that works for you. Okay, so this audience member said, do you believe it is possible that China is patiently waiting for Russia to get weaker and ultimately absorb the country? China has already included Russian territory in the new China map.
Yeah, so I think they want a dominant or superior position over Russia over the long term, and favorable resource treatment and others. But I don't think they necessarily want to conquer Russian territory. One, Russia's a nuclear power. So as long as it has nuclear weapons, that makes that very dangerous. There's other forms of influence they can do. But also, China's roughly the size of the United States. We're both big countries. We don't need to go conquering other places. We need to be innovative and advance our technology. That's where power is going to come from, not so much conquest.
Well, thank you so much again, Mike. And Greg, I'll turn it over to you if you have any kind of closing comments. We just thank you both so much for being here.
It was a privilege to get to do this conversation with Mike, who I've known for many years. I just would encourage everybody to pick up the book. It's really a terrific, it's a terrific history of the post-Cold War period in the United States and in terms of global security. But as you've seen from the conversation here, it's also very enlightening and very thought-provoking about the challenges that lie before us now. So congratulations on the book, Mike, and it's great to catch up with you.
And if I could just add one thing at the end, it was great to have this conversation with my old friend Greg, who always keeps me on my toes, and a special treat to do it with the World Affairs Council of my hometown. When I was a kid, I used to hike up to the Hollywood sign a lot, and so that made this extra special.
Well, thank you both again. We really just appreciate you being here. And again, the book, there is a link in the chat. So please, if you haven't already, check out By All Means Available. The link is in the chat and you can purchase it there. So thank you both. For our members and audience, we hope to see you next Thursday, October 5th for the Dan Schnur Political Report. We also hope you'll join us for 2 special programs in October in partnership with Loyola Marymount University. First, on October 10th, we host a screening of the film Freedom on Fire, Ukraine's Fight for Freedom with filmmaker Yevgeny Afanyevsky. Then on October 19th, join us for a panel conversation titled XYZ and Boomers Too, The Generations and the US Economy. So take a look at our website for details and additional upcoming programs. We'll see you again soon. And again, thank you so much to Greg and Mike for being here today.
Thank you.